So on Shavuot, as we know, one of the things that we do is we stay up late. We spend the night studying and thinking and talking and wrestling with big and hard ideas and topics. And what could be a bigger and more difficult topic right now than what's going on in Israel, which is occupying a lot of our thoughts for a lot of us right now. And for me and for Libby here, it's not only what we're thinking about, it's what we're working on. So Libby, talk a little bit about what our last couple of days has been like.
These last few days have been really hard and really painful and scary. I think like people all over the world, like you and I we're really far away from there. And in some ways, the whatever happens in Israel is both an issue, it's our work, but we're also really personally connected to people and to place. I mean, we spend a lot of our time, you and me, on the ground there. My whole family lives there. We are part of an organization that has 70 people plus hundreds of people that work in the organizations that we support. And so we're waking up early in the morning, reading the newspapers, waiting to see what happens next with bated breath, just like people are all over the world. But we're also on staff calls with Israelis and Palestinians. And I'm getting texts from my whole family all the time. My sister taking my two little nieces, 3 and 8 years old, into bomb shelters every night in the middle of the night and at bedtime. And all of that's happening. I was thinking about that moment. When was that even? I guess that must have been like 3 days ago or something. And we were on our regular call, one of our staff calls with the 5 of us, including our director in Israel, Mickey Gitson, who's a dear friend and a very close colleague to both of us. And in their apartment, like so many apartments in Tel Aviv, there's a sort of sectioned off room that's the bomb shelter room, the sealable room, which many of the newer constructions in Israel and in Tel Aviv in particular have, as well as the bomb shelters underground. And during the pandemic, that room was Mickey's office. It's been his office. So we were just on Zoom like we are right now with him. And then you remember this, that his husband Moti just at some point like busted into the room with their 1-year-old baby daughter over his shoulder and was screaming, there's sirens, because up until that point, we hadn't heard from Hamas. There hadn't been rockets over Tel Aviv or anywhere near. It was really a escalation that was pretty contained to Jerusalem until that point. And we were on Zoom with Mickey when the first sirens in Tel Aviv went off, and his husband Moti was standing there. First the siren went off and Mickey was wearing noise canceling headphones, so he didn't hear. And then suddenly Moti was flinching like this and saying, there's booms, I hear booms. And, we learned later that there were hundreds of rockets that rained over Tel Aviv in that night. And we were there with him on Zoom in their bomb shelter. And my mother and father, who are next door neighbors to Mickey, texting me saying how close it felt, so all of that is going on while we're also navigating what we should be doing, how we can explain what's going on to people in our community, how we can take action in a meaningful way to support the thousands, the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews and Arabs who really want something different and fight for that something different every day. So, that's how the last few days have been for us, I think, in a nutshell. And, you've been doing a lot of public speaking, as have I, with communities, with decision makers and policymakers and all of that. And so, there's a lot going on. There's a lot to keep track of. And I think you should talk about how we got to this point. How did this start? What is going on? Because I think it's really important for people to understand that.
So there are several components that come together in this current crisis. And what I'm going to talk about are how the various strands come together. And I think that there are 5 of them. The first one is a major argument over a small neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. The second one is the broader context of Israeli policy in and about Jerusalem, mixed with extremist views about Jerusalem on both sides, but in particular, for our purposes, on the Jewish-Israeli side. 3 is the cynical and murderous role that Hamas plays in all of this, But while it's cynical and murderous, I'm going to argue to you that it is a rational actor role. As a term of art in international relations, they're a rational actor. In other words, you could predict what they were going to do, and they did what people predicted they would do. 4 is how Israeli politics weigh into all of this. And then finally, the most upsetting thing, I think, for the two of us, which is even more than the shooting war, the terror of what is now happening for the first time in decades in the streets of Israel's mixed cities, which is intercommunal mob violence, Arab against Jews, citizens of the state of Israel. Okay, Sheikh Jarrah. To understand the dispute about Sheikh Jarrah, you got to go back in time a little bit. In 1948, during the war that surrounded Israel's creation, 700,000 Palestinians who live in what is now Israel, including West Jerusalem, were kicked out or fled from their homes, and about 10,000 Jews who lived in what is now the West Bank or East Jerusalem were kicked out or fled their homes. And then when the dust settled, there was an armistice line called the Green Line that became the internationally recognized eastern border of the state of Israel, running right down through the middle of Jerusalem. In 1968, a year after Israel captured East Jerusalem in the 1967 Six-Day War, annexed it, by the way, the international community, including the US, even including the Trump administration, never recognized and does not recognize that annexation. But Israel annexed that territory and has controlled it completely since then. That is the city of Jerusalem. In 1968, the Israeli parliament passed a law that allowed Jewish Israelis who had claims on property that was Jewish owned in East Jerusalem to go to court to regain that property, to evict the current residents and regain that property. But the law does not apply the other way around. If you were a Palestinian who lived in West Jerusalem or anywhere else in Israel, and now you live in East Jerusalem or the West Bank since 48, you cannot apply that law to reclaim your property. That's right, the law applies to Jews only. So when you hear the official line that what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is just a private real estate dispute between two parties, it is disingenuous at best and misleading and dissembling at worst. And as Michael Barbaro said yesterday on the Daily in the New York Times, calling it a real estate dispute is, you can call it a real estate dispute, but you got to call the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict a real estate dispute if you're going to do that. Because this is really a political dispute for the reasons I just said. So 6 families live in homes that the Jordanians built in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah after 1948. After that, those families had fled from what is now West Jerusalem and the state of Israel. And they were built on land that 2 Jewish trusts claim in the 1870s they had purchased from Arab landlords. Okay, this is important. And this is the legal dispute. And so those Jewish trusts handed the property rights over to settler organizations, that is, Jewish Israeli settlers who were trying to move Jews into East Jerusalem and into the West Bank. So it's not like the people who sued were people who once lived in those houses. They're Jewish settlers. That is going to the Supreme Court of the State of Israel, the High Court. It was meant to be finally heard on Monday, the case about these evictions. That coincided with the month of Ramadan in Jerusalem and the Israeli holidays of Independence Day, Memorial Day, and Jerusalem Day, where Israelis celebrate the reunification of the city. And there are traditionally right-wing marches that go through Jerusalem. And these caused all kinds of protests. And in the midst of those protests, the Israeli police closed down the Damascus Gate Plaza, which is kind of town square for Palestinians, wouldn't let them celebrate their break fast during Ramadan there. And then after right-wing Israeli youth rampaged in Arab neighborhoods after some TikTok videos of Palestinian kids slapping Orthodox Jews on the light rail train surfaced, the Israeli police ended up, the Israeli government ended up rerouting the annual radical march on Flag Day, on the Flag March during Jerusalem Day, through the Jewish quarter of the Old City instead of the traditional Muslim quarter. Okay, right? Deep breath. So that was where things were on Monday when suddenly the Israeli police decided to raid the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex. We don't really know why they did it. There were kids up there, young people who had stones that they were going to confront the Jewish rampaging right-wingers with. The Israeli police raided it. Hamas then saw that they had a golden opportunity, a silver platter that had been handed to them by the situation. Because as I said, Hamas is murderous and it's cynical, but it's a rational actor. And there they are in Gaza, stuck in Gaza. They're autocrats. They're unpopular with their own population. And their one chance at gaining seats in the Palestinian parliament were postponed when the head of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Fatah party, canceled the first Palestinian election in 15 years. So you're Hamas, you're looking for a way to reassert your leadership, you're looking for a way to win Palestinian hearts and minds, and Israeli policy, Sheikh Jarrah, the raid on Al-Aqsa, the rampaging ultra-Orthodox and ultra-right-wing Jewish youth gave them that excuse, and they started firing missiles at Jerusalem. Now, they knew that Israel would respond, as it did, with harsh response in Gaza. But let's be clear, whether or not Hamas is a genocidal organization that only wants to kill Jews, I can't answer that question. I can tell you that that's not why they started shooting the missiles. They didn't think they were going to defeat the Israeli state by firing several thousand missiles at Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and other communities. They are trying to make a move for primacy within Palestinian politics. Then the penultimate point, right? You've got the Israelis. The Israeli government was about to, or the Israeli opposition coalition was a couple of days, we think, away from forming an alternative to Bibi Netanyahu's government for the first time in 12 years. They were about to go to the president of Israel and say, following the election of 2 months ago, we're ready to form a government. And then this happened. And now that's on hold. So Netanyahu looks like he may live to see another day in politics, or at least a fifth election. To what extent he has provoked these events, I couldn't say, but he may be the beneficiary. Finally, last point. Because of the laws and rhetoric that have come down from the top leadership in Israel these last 12 years, laws that reduced Arab Israeli citizens to second-class citizenship in what's called the nation-state law, right, which removed Arabic as an official state language, said only the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in Israel. Laws like what we call the Nakba law, making it an offense punishable by defunding by the government if Palestinian institutions recognize the events of May 1948 as the Nakba or catastrophe. These laws, rhetoric from the prime minister saying Arabs are voting in droves, rhetoric from the former foreign minister saying disloyal Arabs should be beheaded. This caused Arab Israelis to feel truly like they were being reduced to second-class citizenship. And when the Sheikh Jarrah protests happened, not only Palestinians from East Jerusalem and the West Bank, not only left-wing Jews, but also Arab Israelis came to Jerusalem to participate in those protests. And when the situation exploded into war, Arab and Jewish mobs, young people mostly, took to the streets and began attacking each other. And that's where we are now. And Libby, give a little bit of hope in telling people what we're doing to try to douse those flames.
You know, we all know that we haven't been sleeping. We've been working around the clock. And I think it's a lot of things. Mainly, I think that people around the world are reading headlines and they're really confused. And so I think that the explanation that you just gave is a first source of help, is just helping people understand what's going on. But I also think that people around the world end up with this situation flattened. It's an issue. And I think what we've been doing, and what I feel really proud of, is continuing to reinforce the fact that this is about people. It's about real people living in a real place. Those people are getting up every day after taking their kids into bomb shelters or trying to protect their kids or themselves or their property where they don't have bomb shelters, and trying to make a better future together. And so I think it's really important for those of us who are experiencing this from afar to remember that there are people on the ground, and it's the majority of Israelis and Palestinians, and it's the majority of Jews and Arabs who want something different today and are going to be putting their bodies on the line to work for something better for their kids and for themselves in the future. And that it's our responsibility in so many ways to support their efforts to do that. And so whether it's vigils and marches or legal aid or neighborhood watches or simple things like neighborly relations, like this is what Israelis and Palestinians are going to be dealing with. They're going to be dealing with, first, putting out these fires. Second, starting to rebuild trust at the very basic level of human relationships. And then we're going to talk about strategy for how we actually build the better future that we all deserve. But the message that I keep wanting to just say to all of my American and Canadian and British friends is that the mobs and the militias and the extremists is the minority there, just like it's the minority here. and that our counterparts, our friends, our family, people we've never met, but that are just like us, Israelis and Palestinians, really are wishing for, praying for, and working for a better future. And we can be part of that from wherever we are. And that is inspiring, it's hopeful, and it's true.
Amen and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.